Term clickbait is one that you hear thrown around often in esports, particularly on esports subreddits like r/League of Legends. Most people don't seem to actually understand what the term means or what the concept is behind it or the mechanism of how it works. Mainly as they don't actually understand journalism, despite what they may imagine. I mean, I realize they think because they consume journalism or the product of journalism that they understand it, but oftentimes they don't. Now, I'll give you two definitions or sections of definitions I've picked out here that I think really elucidate what the point of clickbait is and what clickbait really is. So this one says clickbait, informal noun. On the internet, content, especially that of a sensational or provocative nature whose main purpose is to attract attention and draw visitors to a particular website. Now, this is another section where I took another definition and it had a similar first part, but I've taken this second part because I think it helps explain another aspect of it. Clickbait headlines typically aim to exploit the curiosity gap, providing just enough information to make the reader curious, but not enough to satisfy their curiosity without clicking through to the linked content. From a historical perspective, the techniques employed by clickbait authors can be considered derivative of yellow journalism, which presents little or no legitimate, well-researched news and instead uses eye-catching headlines that include exaggerations of news events, scandal-mongering, or sensationalism. Now, the meaning of my title, Your Clickbait is My Good Marketing, is that what most people are labeling as clickbait not only isn't clickbait, but actually is just good marketing. So when I do my work and I pick the titles for it and I see how I'm going to present this to the public before they've actually had a chance to read it, what's going to draw their eye, what's going to explain to them what the piece of content's about, I use titles that people, some people, not everyone, will claim a clickbait, or will, if they think that the article wasn't good, they'll claim, oh, this was just a clickbait title, or you've just done this because it's topical, so it's clickbait. Now, these titles and my pieces of work are not clickbait in any of the senses I've just described, especially not in the traditional sense. Like, they don't lead you to what is then poorly researched material, which is derivative, nor does my work exaggerate, scandalmonger, or sensationalize. The opinions I put out there are legitimately the opinions I think are valid. I think conclusions that I come through based on my own philosophy on life and deep thought on the matter. I'm not just picking them. Like, I don't just sit down and go, what opinion would really piss off everyone who's a Curse fan today? Obviously, I picked an old team purposely, sort of make it out anachronistic here. What would piss off a Curse fan? If I said that I will dominate, the jungler of the team is the shittest jungler in the world. There we go. I will dominate shittest jungler. That would be clickbait. I don't do that. If I think I will dominate is underwhelming, I might have an article like I will dominate analysis of I will dominate's underwhelming career, something like that. That's the sort of thing I might do. Now, you might say that's clickbait. It's not in this sense. That's not the reason it's being done. It's not some mad curiosity gap that's trying to lead you to poorly researched material. Whether you like the work or not, it's entirely up to you. But here's the point I'm going to make here, is that people who do think my work is clickbait in this sense, or the work of similar people who are very good in the esports industry, haven't really sat down to think about these definitions. Or perhaps, let's give them credit, maybe they're just too stupid to understand the distinction. The problem with clickbait, that kind of work, is that the distinction between clickbait and the kind of work I'm talking about is that clickbait, to me, as it is described in those definitions as well, is work which on some sense leads to this notion that you were in some way tricked when you clicked on it. The click seemed appealing and good and you wanted to click it, that's why you did click it, but when you actually saw the article, you feel like you were conned. You feel like you were tricked in some way, and that's why it's clickbait. The key, as you can see by that second definition I gave there, the one that was, the basics of it were clickbait headlines aim to exploit the curiosity gap, and then the part about the techniques being sensationalist, etc. The key point about exploiting that curiosity gap is that fucking hell, is that when you do arrive at that work, you click on it, so you wanted to click on it, you did click on it, when you arrive at that work, it is ultimately underwhelming. Due to being poorly researched, too thin on information. I mean, think of when people do lists of top 10 NBA players. You have to click and it goes to a list page on Bleacher Report or whatever site you would be, and you have to click through all 10 pages, and then even then it's not a well-done thing. It's a massive picture of the guy, and then it's 1.5 sentences about the player. That feels underwhelming. That doesn't feel like I really got to find out that there. You just gave me a list. I thought I was going to find out some sort of expansive article or a unique perspective on it or a philosophy that's consistent across it. I didn't get that, and so I feel like I've been conned in that particular sense. So the initial feeling you get is curiosity. You want to click the link. The title's appealing, so you want to click it. You click it, everything's okay so far, but then you're left wishing that you hadn't clicked it, and you almost feel like a kind of buyer's remorse, like, fuck, I wish I could get that click back, those few seconds of my life back. So I'll give you an example to show the distinction between what clickbait might be, at least what some people would consider it, and what my work would be in the same example. So now imagine an article in esports that was titled Reaper's Revenge, How the King of Korea Came Back for More. There's the title and subtitle. Problem is, you go to the article, that sounds awesome. I mean, I love Reaper. I thought his history was fantastic. Maybe if I was a fan and I hadn't researched his whole career, I'd love to read that article. I click on it, great, let's see what this is all about, Reaper's Revenge. And let's say it's only 1,500 words. It skims most of his career. It's basically almost just like someone's taken his esportspedia or esports wikis, as it's now called, and just taken the facts and just put a couple of sentences joining them together. There's not really anything there. It's everything everyone pretty much knew about his career anyway. The most basic surface material. There's not even anything new. There's not even any extra quotes or any extra like detailing of his career. And more importantly, there's nothing interesting or unique or well done about the way the analysis of his career or the articulation and telling of his story is done in his career. In that sense, you might feel remorse, right? You might feel like, oh, fuck, what was the point in that? To give you an example, I actually did an article about Reaper's career, but it was called Reaper's Game, One Against All. Now, I have also gone with a title that's evocative, it's appealing, it does raise your curiosity. It's like, oh, Reaper's game? Why was it his game? In what way was he one against all? But if you go to this article, it's massive, it's thousands of words long, there's tons of new information that's never been in any Reaper articles before, there's details of games that people actually now in the West can't even see because they don't exist anywhere on the internet. I have access to them through special means through the Korean scene and friends I have there, and I've watched all those games. I made notes about them all, and then I didn't overload you with info about every game. I gave you the overview of the concept of his career, but by knowing all the details, I could use that iceberg principle of Hemingway to give you the key information, and therefore there's a lot there. In fact, there's more there implied than it even says. That's how deep the article goes. Now, here's the interesting point to make. Even though the first one could be clickbait, if that author had been very cynical, like he was someone who could have done an article like mine, but you know what, he's decided not to. He's decided he's only going to put in half an hour, he's going to just skim everything, quickly write it all up, then he picks a title that sounds really cool as though it's a title for an article like mine, puts the title on there, tricks you into clicking it, and he's got your click anyway. It's the same click that you would have given to me, and then you feel ripped off, and he feels like I didn't have to put in much effort, but I got the clicks anyway. In that sense, his article would qualify as clickbait, especially if his title, which is very provocative, very bold, didn't actually lead to anything. Like, he didn't explain how it was Reaper's Revenge. He didn't really put any of the aspects into that, and he just left it the most basic info that you already knew before you'd even clicked it. In that sense, I'd agree, his would in some sense qualify as clickbait. Problem even there, though, is that actually, from knowing most of the journalists in esports, most of the people who write article 1 that I've just described there aren't actually even clickbaiting. In fact, they think they're writing my article. They just are too young in the game. They haven't developed their techniques. They don't know how to research. They don't know where they'd go to find this information. They're doing their best. They really think they've done a good article. They've tried to put it together. Their techniques are amateurish. Their skill level isn't good enough yet. They haven't grinded. They haven't worked on their abilities. They haven't expanded their skill set to be more versatile, to know about how to tell different types of stories, to know what to keep in, what to leave out, how deep to go. So as a result, it's just them being bad, essentially. They actually haven't put it as clickbait either. Now, the point that I want to make here, which is the whole central point of this video, is that I actually don't think that the mechanisms of clickbait in titles, which is where we're mainly talking about it now in esports and in my work, are actually a bad thing. I think they're just misapplied and they're used for a very low effort approach, which is why the end result is a net negative to most of our lives, and we feel like it's a waste of time to read their articles. I think the mechanisms are actually just the mechanisms of how you market things. So my work, and essentially all successful work of this kind in this field, in nearly all cases, fulfills that part of the clickbait definition of the main purpose is to attract attention, draw visitors to a particular website. But we're not doing it necessarily through sensational, provocative titles, content purely for the sake of getting you to click, and that's the click's it. You're supposed to enjoy the article when there. It doesn't lead you to poorly researched stuff. My titles and the character of the content that I'm working on entirely reflects the actual legitimate nature of the work that I produced itself and has an integrity to it in the construction of it. With that said, obviously the goal is, after creating the work, to produce the most interesting, the most well articulated headline that is bold, but it invokes curiosity if it's something you would want to read about anyway, and it's appealing if you would like the content at the end. I'm reverse engineering it that way. If you're someone who would like this article, I want to make sure from the headline that you get a chance to come and see it, that the headline itself isn't too vague or too generic, that you don't know how great the content is here over at this end. So that's quite different from the other end, because they're just trying to get the click. I'm trying to get you the click and then come and actually read the article, because I think the articles has some merit if that's the sort of thing you're into. That's why you also can't lie when you do it. So there's a key distinction to make. A key distinction is that a title that I'm talking about that's not clickbait is never something which is provocative but not authentic to the work. And also the work must match up to the title and the nature and the way the title is presented. Like if it's very sensational, then the work must address these topics and be legitimate in that sense. It can't just be sensational and then the work doesn't cover any of those topics. So as a result, when it's my work, you click the link, but the content delivers on what the title promises. And so in that sense, even these titles and the mechanism behind them ends up being the opposite outcome to clickbait. Because the end result of my approach to it is you click it because you want to, and then the article delivers. The clickbait approach just wants you to click. The article doesn't have to deliver at the end. That's the whole problem with how they've applied the mechanism. They've only put in the first front end of it and not the back end. So those who think that even this approach is somehow dishonest have again failed to understand the appropriate use of the mechanism I just outlined or the distinction I just made. Clickbait is dishonest because it seeks simply to rile up your emotions, get you excited, get you curious, trick you into clicking, and then that's it. There's nothing else beyond that point. There's very little effort put in. I'm not tricking anyone. The majority of the effort has gone into the part after the click. Guess what? Those 3,000 word articles with loads of research take a lot longer than coming up with a fucking headline, coming up with a cool headline that might fit into the topical milieu of the day. So I'm not trying to trick anyone. What I'm trying to do is do quality work which appeals to people in as much as I've done it in a manner that's well, so people like me might enjoy it. And then the headline tries to get people who might enjoy it to then want to click it if that's something they can then understand why they'd enjoy it, etc. Or why they'd want to experience it rather. Maybe they won't enjoy it, but they might want to experience it. So consider the difference between if you were to highlight, or rather, consider the difference between highlighting some exciting feature or characteristic of a product and just straight out lying about it. Similar mechanism, it seems, right? But the difference is when you buy the product where you highlighted an exciting feature or characteristic, it has those things. The other one has exaggerated or maybe just outright lied about them having those things. Now, most people who comment on this topic, surprise, surprise, have no clue about journalism. They hold incredibly, you can see when they try to explain what you should have done, they hold incredibly naive and outright plainly ineffective notions, like that you should just pick a plain title and then somehow it's some sort of like, let the chips fall where they may, and just sit back and hope people pour through the door and essentially consume your product. Now that's a terrible approach, even if you have the best product of all time, because having the best product alone will not bring success. You have to learn how to articulate why it's the best, what makes it the best. You have to obviously build up a name. This is why name value exists. But also even in the way you present it. It's not sensational in the maddest sense. Sensational in a manner where that's because it is a sensational thing what you've done. It's incredible. You've done something that you're going against the grain because it's what you really think. So in this sense, you've got to figure out how to translate the feeling that the product would give to the person. And they then go there and they get that feeling and they then experience what you were implying. And that's what it imbues this kind of article, the title, with the necessary gravitas or feeling or emotion that they should be getting when they read the article itself. That's what marketing and advertising, when used appropriately, can achieve. Now, the reason why I can speak on this topic at length, aside from the fact I've been in the business for like 15 years, is because actually, believe it or not, up until about 2010, I actually didn't employ the mechanisms behind this. I didn't understand it myself. I hadn't learned that aspect of journalism yet. I used to think that, again, I only want to be judged on the quality of the work and all the rest of it. And so I used to think that meant that I had to use generic titles. And in fact, the more generic it was, then all the success on the article, I knew that was because the article was great and all the rest of that. Now, first of all, I did come at the time from the era before there was YouTube, Twitter, or Reddit. Again, these things didn't exist when I was around. People used to come to my website either specifically, directly, and then look what was on the website, or they'd find articles by a news writer on another website writing up about it, and then he'd essentially explain why you should read it, and then they'd click it and go to it. So as a result, this approach even worked in the early days, and it wasn't necessarily to understand the mechanisms of how to appeal to people and how to articulate what's good about your article and how to have a catchy title, essentially. But when I used these generic titles in the latter day, particularly coming up to like 2009, 2010, what I realized was this was limiting my success massively. And other people who were using shitty clickbait, they were just putting low effort in, were getting the clicks, but it wasn't delivering. Meanwhile, my piece, someone might not click it because I hadn't done a good enough job of articulating what it was about, the feeling, a cool aspect to it, that they wouldn't know that the article was cool and that it had this awesome feeling to it, and it was this sort of vibe about it. And as a result, people weren't going to mine when they would have wanted to read mine. They were going to some other piece of shit when they wouldn't want to read that. So actually, I realized, I looked, and I didn't just say, well, that's just, you're just lucky, or you're just like being dishonest. They were, but what I did is I looked at the mechanisms behind it. I had to observe, what is it about it that's getting people to click here? Why would you click that? What's appealing about that title, even if the end result wasn't there in the end? And so what I learned was the mechanisms. How do you gather people's attention? How do you attract curiosity? How do you then apply those mechanisms in a meaningful manner, but not for cheap tricks or what ends up being low effort work, and as a result is dishonest to some nature? Now, as an interesting note, this is essentially where all marketing came from, is using these mechanisms in a meaningful manner for significance, to imply something more and to have an effect symbolically on the human mind, which is that thousands of years ago, this is what magic and art was about, figuring out the effect that certain symbols had on the mind, certain colors associated with certain symbols, a stag, but a green stag, and with a red crown upon it, whatever these things might mean, have a different effect upon the mind, especially within a certain social construct where those symbols have had past relevances or significances. And when you learn how to manipulate these aspects, then you get to the position where you can have what seem to be magical effects, because you have an effect that an idea comes from your mind and is transmitted to someone else's mind and recreated in a similar fashion. Therefore, suddenly, everyone in a certain area can be thinking and feeling the same way just from seeing a symbol or a certain set of words or a jingle or a piece of music and all these associations of color, etc. And yet it was just a symbol. And so in that particular sense, these sigils, these magical icons, these understanding the correspondences of colors, symbols, styles to certain godheads, which just represent larger ideas, archetypal ideas in the human imagination through our history. In doing so, the problem is those used to be used for, well, I'd say honest means. They were used for religious means a lot of the time, but I think a lot of those people were earnest when they did that, and so they were trying to create a special sense in you when you saw the stained glass window in the church and those certain symbols that we know mean about Jesus and the cross and Mary, Mother Mary and all that shit. So the saints and all that good shit. So we all know what those evoke within you, and the fact that the ambience of the church and the music you hear. One thing a lot of people don't know is music now doesn't have the same effect it did in the past, to the degree that in the past people couldn't own their own instruments. People didn't know how to read music. People didn't know how to create music, except artisans who did this aspect, who were the musicians and were the creators of art in that time. So as a result, an opera had an incredible effect on society when people experienced this absolutely incredible apocalyptic themes and a huge material and bold numbers and all sorts of things going on that would evoke within you emotion, not just the same as just hearing a piece of music. That's cool music, I like that music. So as a result, just as music and pop music have brought these things down to the level of just a ditty that you hum or elevator music and kind of sullied them to some degree, but not in as much as the mechanism still exists and you can use it for great work. I mean, a great example of music exactly like what I'm talking about, this a modern day example would be a band called Explosions in the Sky. This is a music that evokes the absolute grandeur of life and what's incredible about the emotional component of human life. But likewise, this technology, these mechanisms have been sullied and taken down to a most base level by the advertisers, the broadcasters, the marketers. And these are people who use these techniques for the most low-level manner to simply bamboozle you or to make you feel a certain way about a product they want to sell you or to appeal to your most base desires, to even consider buying something or put in your mind that you want something that maybe you don't even and you don't need, but then you think you do because of the associations created with it. So in the same way as you can take back art, I've taken back the mechanisms of clickbait and what people think of as clickbait, but I don't use them for any of the negative aspects, the unproductive aspects. I use it to actually make quality work have a further reach. And that's one of the reasons why, like it or hate it, why I've had more success in many ways than other fantastic people who work within this industry. And as a result, I've had to explain to some of these people who are friends of mine, when they've asked me about it, the same lessons I had to go through. So for example, there were times when I would write an 8,000 word piece about a StarCraft player, and at the end of it, I would think, right, now what am I going to put as the title? And I'd come up with a title in like 5 seconds. I'd put the title, I'd be out there, and maybe like 10 minutes later, I'd think, shit, I could actually have done a much better title there. And by spending 1 minute on the title and spending, God knows, like 10 hours, maybe more, researching and writing the article, I realised what a mad differential this is, bearing in mind the first thing people are going to see, in fact the only thing they're going to see, is the title and maybe a little picture. So I had to tell other people, your work might be fantastic, you're doing a great job there, but also put some time into learning this aspect. Play around with what different titles, what the effects are, what people think of them, all the rest of it, and then learn how to match up good titles with good work, and that's where overall success will come. It's not good enough to have a great product and great meals if people don't know where the restaurant is, like it doesn't have an easily memorable name, you haven't done a good job of having a good tagline, hasn't described the type of food. There's all different ways you can attract in this sense. So clickbait, as a lot of people define it in esports, particularly at r/League of Legends, isn't clickbait at all. It's just good marketing.